Well, I think we might get going, gentlemen. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a webinar from Tenant CS. And today, I'm proud actually to be presenting Chris Martin and Craig Shepherd from Korda Mentha. And the reason that I've asked these gentlemen to talk today was really that where we are in the cycle from us at Tenant CS in regards to leasing is that we've sort of gone through the beginning of the economic crisis, and people have sort of been all hands to deck and just making ends meet, etc., and paying the bills. And the question is where to next. And what I wanted to discuss, or get the gentleman to discuss, was other options that go beyond what people like us as tenant reps can do in terms of onerous and legacy leases, which ideally are fixed, so that post September, when JobKeeper finishes, that your companies are in a much healthier and better state in order that profitability can be maximised and the future growth achieved. So, with no further ado, Craig is a partner in the restructuring, and Craig, unfortunately, they've both got the same name tag. So Craig is the, he told me he's the handsome one, which is the grey-haired, and Chris, the dark-haired. So they're just the simple ones. So, gentlemen, let me hand over to you, and obviously any questions, please send them in under the chat, and I will pass them on to the gentleman concerned. So I'll pass it over to you guys.
Thanks very much, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us in really extraordinary times. So I guess as was indicated, Craig is our national head of restructuring. So Craig does leads a very big team that does the formal voluntary administrations and receivership, and I lead another part of our business, which is our corporate turnaround and transformation. So between us, we cover most of the turnarounds, receiverships, voluntary administrations that Korda Mentha see. So between us, hopefully we can address most of your issues and bring some slightly different but related experiences and concepts. So we're just going to, there's a fair bit to get through today. We're just going to touch on 4 key issues. The deck will be available to people who want it, so feel free to listen and take notes if you want it, but we're very happy for the deck to be circulated to the extent that people find there's things of value in it. So we thought the first thing that we would do, just to give people a bit of a very quick refresher on some of the key concepts and corporations law solutions. So obviously we live in it every day, but I appreciate most people on this call, fortunately for them, don't live in it every day, but it's pretty important as we enter the new world, I think, that people get a rebased grounding in some of the concepts. And then what we are seeing and increasingly expect to see is a real focus on the deeds of company arrangement, which Craig will talk about. But essentially, that's the process by which a company can exit a voluntary administration in a leaner, meaner, sort of fitter shape. So the deed of company arrangement will be a big focus for what we do today. And then obviously, like all of these corporate activities, be they mergers and acquisitions, be they capital raisings, be they equity raises, be they debt raises, be they voluntary administrations, there are a number of issues, risks and key opportunities. So we're going to talk about that. But then we've found over the years as we've been doing this that a lot of people actually really like to hear some lessons from the front line. And we've got a couple of case studies and examples that we think might make it a little more real, a little more tangible for people on the call. So with that intro, I might hand over to Craig just to give us all a bit of a crash reminder in some of the key concepts.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, look, I'm the Craig with the grey hair because I've been in insolvency for over 25 years. I'm going to stick to that as my excuse for the grey. I'm probably being a bit generous of myself here. It's probably white. A few, I guess, key concepts about corporations law, and particularly as related to insolvency. First and foremost, for all of you out there, particularly if you're directors of companies, or I guess even remind people, if you're the director of a sporting association, the same duties follow. I'm actually dealing with Equestrian Australia at the moment, reminding directors there that whilst it's a volunteer position, you still come with the same risk, whether it's your own private company or a volunteer organisation. So directors' duties, if you're not familiar, you should be, and you should be looking at Section 180, which sums it up on the basis that a director's duty under 180 is to act with due care and diligence. You need to make decisions in good faith without any personal interest and rational decisions and in the best interest of the corporation. That's a really important starting point that as an insolvency practitioner, whenever I get involved, if once we take that form position, we're required to look at that and understand why a company is in that position and did directors breach their duties. So there's a number of other duties, but I think if you focus on that one, that's probably the best one to start with and covers, you get that one right and you're heading in the right direction. As you're all aware, there's been plenty of press over the last few months with COVID. Fortunately, Josh Frydenberg stepped up and made a really good decision with some temporary relief around directors' duties. From an insolvency practitioner, it's traditionally been a major trigger to have directors come and speak to us about the trading whilst insolvent issues. But just as a refresher, what's he done? As of March, the Treasurer has amended the insolvent trading laws to give some temporary relief for directors to, I guess, catch their breath, put their company into hibernation, and I guess take them off that burning deck so they don't need to make that, I guess, major step and force good companies into insolvency, because most companies through this COVID time have got issues around insolvent trading. When you break it down, I'll talk a little bit about what insolvent trading is shortly. He's also made some temporary changes around enforcement of debts, which again has been good. So your 21-day notice is now 6 months. The statute demand hurdle's gone from 2,000 to 20,000. Obviously, the downside with that, with all businesses, you're trying to look after your liquidity and trying to claw in debt recovery. It does make it a little bit harder if people are keeping their money in their pocket and not paying their debts as well. So it'll be something that the Treasury is going to have to change and bring people out of that, and that'll be an interesting process in itself. But just as a refresher on what is insolvency, in the Corporations Act, it actually defines it as basically, it doesn't say whether you're insolvent, it says whether you're solvent. So to be insolvent, you've got to fall up on the solvency definition. The solvency definition is about being able to pay your debts as and when they fall due, quite simply. So, and as an insolvency practitioner, when we look at it, the common tests for insolvency are, there are a number of tests and case law around it, but generally there's a cash flow test and a balance sheet test. Cash flow being having the readily available cash to meet those debts. Balance sheet, leaning on the balance sheet at times to being able to, I guess, convert liquid assets into cash or leverage fixed assets to cash to be able to meet those immediate liabilities. So then moving on, what is insolvent trading? It's exactly that. It's, I guess it's an offence for directors to trade a company when the company's not in a position, or the directors should have knowingly been in a position to know that the company couldn't meet that debt as of when it fell due, or as a consequence of entering into that debt, the company is deemed insolvent or is entered into a dishonest debt around, which again has put the company into that position. So what do directors do when they're faced with insolvency? There's a number of things that you can look for. You may be familiar with the safe harbour provisions, which were recently introduced, when I say recently, a couple of years ago. So there's an ability, arguably what the Treasury has done and what most insolvency lawyers are saying, and the commentary around it is the Treasurer has given everyone the opportunity through the temporary measures to put all companies into a safe harbour provision, which I think that's right. But to go into a formal safe harbour, there are some statutory requirements about it. So well, if you feel that you can't meet your debts as when they fall due, if we weren't in these times, then you can go into safe harbour, have some protection, where you don't need to place your company into administration, but it's only a temporary relief. So, and you need to have paid, ensure you're paying your taxes or have lodged all your lodgements up to date at the very least. And there's a number of preconditions there, which I think will trip a number of people up. So when we look at it, it's there's not a lot of companies that actually qualify for safe harbour, to be frank. And part of that qualification is a first step qualification. Then a second step, you need to formulate a better outcome statement. So your plan to be in safe harbour and hopefully come out of safe harbour needs to be a robust plan that you keep testing, which provides a better outcome for stakeholders. But again, if anyone needs more information on that, we're happy to take calls or speak to us directly. There's a number of informal restructuring options as well, which is what Chris and his team in the corporate practice do a lot of. But then there's other director initiated like VA and DOCA. And I want to speak a little bit about VA and DOCA today because there's a real perception in this country about the negativity of VA. And we're publishing some papers around this, and the people we're engaging with, we're talking about and trying to demystify that, because I guess if you reflect on the US system and Chapter 11, that process is viewed as a legitimate mechanism to restructure a business. Voluntary administration is very similar and should also be viewed as a legitimate mechanism, and we're starting to see more companies, particularly in these COVID times, starting to recognise that and engage with us early. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We've also got schemes of arrangement, which I'll touch on, which is a more court-driven process and more driven for large corporates, listed in particular, where there's generally takeovers and alike. And then from a creditor initiated, where when I say creditor, so a bank may have an all-cap security over your company, there's receiverships, and also that they can trigger voluntary administrations as well. But hopefully that's a quick overview, but we'll move on, and Chris will talk a little bit more about some of the other options available for directors, and then we'll flesh out a little bit more about this VA and schemes and the like. Chris, you're on mute.
Thanks, Craig. So we thought it was important just to set the platform of the legal framework. So I appreciate it's not the most exciting of issues to talk about, but I guess having a genuine understanding of the legal framework and mechanism enables you to bring a certain degree of creativity to your commercial solutions. So clearly understanding the technical requirements lets you work out, where you can really push. To give you a sense of how it all fits in from a commercial perspective, there are a range of options available to directors and companies and shareholders, and we've put, some of them here. I guess starting down at the bottom left there, business as usual, it's what we call in the do-it-yourself type category. Most business managers, leaders, owners are able to, satisfactorily discharge, business as usual negotiations. And then you can sort of start to see, we move up to the right there, and there are a range of different approaches, and many of these we've seen in the US and Europe, and increasingly we're starting to see a range of some of these in Australia. So for example, the partnership portfolio approach, we're starting to see some large retailers going to their landlords and saying, look, this concept of a fixed lease payment at the moment is not really working. We need to move to some sort of turnover-based rent. And we'd like to do that in partnership with you. We'll have an open books, program, and you'll get to see it all. Clearly works for some, doesn't work for many. The then other one, which we're starting to see a little bit, is this concept of go dark. So a lot of people say to us, and I'm sure say to Tim, look, we've got a lease, we've got a contract, we're just not going to talk to you. And it's a very aggressive position, and not one that we would counsel without, taking pretty serious thought to. But, some tenants in this country have just gone dark. They have literally just moved their stock out of their stores. They've gone dark. And you would be amazed or not amazed at how quickly you will get your landlord on the phone if you actually move your stuff out of a shop. Again, not for the faint-hearted, and you need to go in, well briefed with good legal understanding. But that is something that we're seeing. The other, moving up the right there, is the corporate restructure, which Craig's spoken about, and then the scheme of arrangement and corporations law, which we're talking about over the next couple of pages. I guess the key issues in all of these things are, risk appetite, timing constraints, and the urgency. And the other point which Craig will talk about is most businesses will have some pretty important third-party stakeholders. Be they personal guarantees, be they bank guarantees, be they bank debt, be they long-term suppliers, be they long-term employees. Just really important as people are thinking through their options that, they take into account a range of these considerations. But that's really setting the framework before we go back now to, I guess, a more detailed deep dive into some of the technical solutions that might be available to people on this call.
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, to get back to the technical side of it, as I said before, the creditor schemes of arrangement, we've put it there, I guess, on the full spectrum of tools that are available. It's company initiated. It's more for large companies. It really doesn't affect the day-to-day operations. Unfortunately, it's a time-consuming, court-driven process, which which makes it probably not as accessible for large corporates or SMEs. It's really the top end of town. Voting for so it's about classifying different creditors or classes of creditors and compromising arrangements around those classes. The hurdle is a lot higher. When I say a lot higher, it's higher than VA, so it's 75% of votes cast and 50% in number. So it's a harder process to run. So it's not something you see, and I don't think we'll see a huge volume of that moving forward, particularly in the last quarter of this year, where we expect to see a lot more restructures coming through. Voluntary administration is, I touched on before, is generally a director initiated, can be creditor initiated, it's generally director, and they take it into their hands. I guess what we're seeing now is a more earlier engagement. Back to what I said before, I think we're trying to change the perception of directors around there, that this is a legitimate tool, particularly in COVID, very applicable. I guess the benefit of it, it could, what we say, it's an opportunity to right-size your business to not only survive, but thrive out the other end. So Chris will talk on the next page about some practical examples around it, but the benefit of a VA in these times would be you get a wholesale moratorium, so it puts any litigation to bed. It puts it locks all your creditors down. It gives you an opportunity to reset with your landlords. It also suspends and locks down any personal enforcement on personal guarantees. On the landlord side of it, which obviously is near and dear to most people on the call today, I guess the catch-all or the outside the commercial imperative of it, I guess the hook in a VA is it's even more powerful, where you haven't got corporate guarantees or personal guarantees hanging off the side of those leases, because I guess the liability and the tail sits within that entity and can be dealt with very cleanly through a restructure, through a deed of company arrangement to reset, move forward with the leases you want and leave the ones you don't behind. And we're seeing a bit more of that and a bit more planning around that. We've used, I guess, call it the threat of VA or formal liquidation as well as part of it in formal negotiations. We recently wound down the whole radio rentals business through an informal compromise as opposed to a formal, based on transparency, by illustrating to landlords what the consequence of a formal wind down would be. And again, we're encouraging all stakeholders to communicate and say, well, the best way is to talk to your landlords, keep your suppliers and the like in the circumstances there. Once we sat with them and I showed them what it would look like if they didn't have a meaningful discussion with us, they quickly realised it was better to work with us and get a better return, which turned out to unlock a substantial portion of the lease tail and allowed the stakeholders in that circumstance to walk away from. But look, it's a quick process. It's generally 8 weeks. You can run it through a deed of company arrangement. People often say to me, what can you do in a deed of company arrangement? My response to that is anything, as long as it's better than liquidation. And most companies that are going into liquidation don't return much to creditors. So it's a very flexible tool to create a compromise and a better outcome for all. Because the primary purpose of voluntary administration, if you actually go to the Corporations Act and look at what's the objective of Part 5.3 out of the Act, is to maximise the chances of business continuing in existence. So we really need, as the, I guess, professionals need to educate directors and the market that the voluntary administration is a legitimate process to restructure, and shouldn't be deemed as a failing of directors. I think you could actually mount an argument in the current COVID environment that a responsible director, or it would be remiss of a director not to explore it in many circumstances and let a company just fail when they could potentially restructure it. Receiverships are more secure creditor driven, and it's less about, I guess, preserving the business and more about recovering assets. So again, I don't want to go into that too much detail, because I think for the people on the phone, the appropriate one where you want to control it, the best way to control and be part of the process is through a voluntary administration. Chris, did you want to oh, actually, I'm going to do this bit as well, aren't I? Right, flexibility of a debt company arrangement, as I touched on. So the beauty of it is it's basically a debt company arrangement through the VA process. You have a first meeting in 10 days. You have a second meeting in 30 business days. The second meeting is called the decision meeting. Why? Because the creditors, it's a creditor-driven process. All creditors have a say. Every creditor has one vote. All resolutions pass on the majority of value, as in dollar value, and the number of votes. So there's not too many circumstances if a director gets involved early and starts to plan through a process that they shouldn't be able to structure a deed of company arrangement. Where they fail is because directors leave it too late. There's not enough runway. There's not enough time or liquidity to structure something that's beneficial. What can you do in it? Let's structure it to provide a better outcome. You can cram down classes. You can, as part of it, as long as every creditor at every stage gets a better outcome, and it's relatively easy because you can buy time through the deed. You can subordinate related party creditors. You can drag through particular lease groups, and depending on where they sit, what the weighted average lease tail is, and work it through. But it's timely, effective, and it's binding on all parties apart from a secure creditor. So very powerful way of dealing with that financial restructure of a balance sheet. So on the right hand side there's a bit of a timeline to what I talked about. So from day one through to the first meeting in 8 business days, then the second meeting, the execution of a VA, we put indicative 40 to 45 days, but I've done one where we've signed that docker within a couple of days after the second meeting, because we've been able to get in a position because of good planning, and then move control of that company back to the directors, and then complete the terms under that deed very quickly, and effectuate the deed to wash the entity through and allow it to move forward. So Chris, I'll hand back to you. Do you want to, let's talk about a couple of, I guess, more notable ones, because I think in our game, when it's business to consumer and people recognise a name, it makes a little bit more sense. But a couple of more notable ones over recent times that we've been involved in, where we've used the deed of a company arrangement process to do restructure, deal with the crisis, stabilise the business, and then bring it out the other end.
Sure, thanks, Craig. So I'll just take a couple of minutes on these, and many people on the call will have heard of these companies and may well have followed, their voluntary administration through the process over the last couple of years. But essentially, these two companies, both very large and well known, are very good examples of companies being put into voluntary administration for the purposes of restructuring and coming out stronger on the other side. As Craig said, for many years, the only companies that have been put into voluntary administration are those that have literally run out of money and cannot pay their bills. But what we have seen over recent years, and we expect to see an increasing number and shift towards, are companies that are actually saying, look, we may or may not be able to pay our bills moving forward, but we do know with absolute certainty that if we put this into a voluntary administration, we can come out leaner and much fitter. And I know for the people on this call, that may well manifest itself in terms of dealing with leases for the bunch of sites that your landlords are not prepared to engage with. So that's, if you like, we're talking about voluntary administration, but we're really talking about voluntary administration on this call as a vehicle for reducing your leasehold liability and getting your net present value down. So the two examples on this page are Areum and Channel 10. So Areum was a very large steel manufacturer and distributor, 150 sites around the world, 7,500 employees, 7,000 contractors, $4 billion of debt. It was a very, very large business. For those of you that know South Australia, it essentially supported the town of Whyalla, which has 22,000 people. So from newsagents, dry cleaners, food suppliers, etc., etc. Essentially, the town of Whyalla was built on Areum. So very high profile, went through a significant voluntary administration. All employees kept their jobs. The return to creditors was materially higher than expected. And the business was ultimately sold in two parts. In this case, the international business was sold and the Australian business was sold to Sanjay, who is in the newspaper again this week, saying that he's going to put a further $1 billion into that Areum business. So again, Areum has come out of its VA much stronger, much leaner, and with a much more compelling investment case to put money in. The second example on the page is Channel 10. We all know Channel 10. Channel 10 is a really interesting example because it's reflective of an organisation that was in an industry in long-term decline. So clearly viewer numbers were down, advertising revenue was down. The shareholders kept writing a check. For the last couple of years, Channel 10 was losing between $100 and $250 million. Ultimately, the shareholders decided that they would not continue to fund the business in its current form, but were happy to look at funding the business depending on certain outcomes with some contractual negotiations. So it was put into voluntary administration. As Craig's point previously, and this is a good example of it, anything that directors wish to propose in a deed of company arrangement can be proposed. And in this case, different categories of creditor got paid different amounts. So a lot of people say to us, well, I don't want to burn my suppliers, or I don't want to burn my employees. They've been long and loyal, et cetera, which we completely get. So Channel 10 was a really interesting example. You can see there, the secured creditor was repaid in full. 100 cents in the dollar was paid for key content providers and trade creditors. So notwithstanding that the business went into voluntary administration, all of those suppliers got paid, 100 cents in the dollar. But unfortunately for financial creditors and the ATO, the deed was struck so that they got paid 60 cents in the dollar. So I guess this is just a really interesting example of the financial flexibility that can be built into deeds of company arrangements if directors have got a view on what the other side might look like. This is the final case study, and this is something that's probably more relevant to most people on this call from a day-to-day perspective. So we've taken a retail site here, but each of these examples is equally applicable for industrial, commercial, etc. But this is an example of a retail leasehold situation. So a client came to us, they had a head office, 150 stores, $50 million contribution margin from the top 100, zero contribution margin from the bottom 50, but obviously the bottom 50 was significantly contributing to overhead costs and complexity of the business. The shareholders and directors had a view that by putting the company into voluntary administration, they could essentially cut the bottom 50 stores. They could then reduce the costs and headcount in head office. They could streamline the business. They could move to more online. And they could also take the opportunity to renegotiate the leases for the stores that they wanted to stay in. So obviously, if you go into voluntary administration with a plan, every contract is up for negotiation if that is the way in which the deed is structured. So in this case, the potential outcome, the head office was streamlined, the bottom 50 stores were exited, and you don't need landlord negotiation to exit those 50 stores in voluntary administration. You can disclaim the leases and you literally can walk from the lease. Obviously, you need to be a bit careful if there are guarantees involved, but if there are no guarantees involved, the voluntary administrator can literally tear up the lease and walk away. So it is a very powerful tool. The company in this case then took the opportunity to renegotiate a series of leases on the other stores. Trade creditors got paid in full and the business emerged ongoing viable. So we expect this is going to be the case study that we are going to see moving forward. And I guess one that's very topical at the moment would be the Virgin Airlines. So Virgin Airlines have obviously started with clearly just looking at the publicly available information with a very large loss-making enterprise that's running a series of loss-making routes. It's got a series of loss-making aeroplanes. And essentially, you can overlay the Virgin restructure on this retail restructure from left to right. So Virgin will emerge much leaner, much hungrier, and far more profitable after having put itself through a voluntary administration. Craig, that's probably all that.
Yeah, I think the other one that's maybe of interest to people and they're reading about in the paper, I think last time we did this presentation, that when we first met Tim on the morning of that presentation, it was in the AFR about PAS going into administration and PwC, the administrators there. And this is exactly that, I guess they're calling it a strategic administration. So strategic in that they're going to strategically attempt to restructure that business, or provide an opportunity for a purchaser to come in, acquire that business through a debtor company arrangement, but only take the profitable parts of that business forward and leave the rest behind.
Yeah. So Craig, before we go to the last page, so the reason that it's just such a powerful, negotiating tool, and again, for people on this call, either negotiating themselves or, working with Tim and Tenant CS, it's a very big stick. The ability to actually walk away from a lease and not pay the landlord a cent is a very big stick. And that's one of the reasons that, we think that people on this call should, familiarise themselves with some of the things here, because we do think it's something that's not particularly well understood, but it's probably the biggest stick that people have got in the bag.
All right, to round it out, I guess just a couple of things to remind everyone. I guess just around the corporations law, and the solutions can be used to accelerate. So don't be scared. I think it's important to understand your options. So I guess if anyone has any concerns or any queries off the back of this, and we run out of time today, please don't hesitate to call. We're here just to provide guidance. I don't expect when someone calls me that I send them an engagement letter or they have to appoint us. I think it's important that people understand their options. And if you haven't been through administration, or this part of the corporation's law, it can get a bit complex. So seek advice. So which leads on to the next one: engage with advisors early and maximise optionality. The perception around VA is because historically directors are reluctant to engage. They wait to the last minute. They're chronically insolvent by the time they get to the table, and at that stage, options are limited because we just haven't got there early enough to try use the runway that could have been used if they had engaged earlier. Choose your advisor wisely. I guess it's always important to. There are a number of people that dabble in the area and do it part-time. You want to deal with, in this area, it is complex, with experienced people with good reputations and strong relationships who you can trust. Because I guess the one issue with this process is you do effectively hand the keys over to the administrator. So when you once they sign a consent and you appoint them, the powers of a director are suspended. So it's really important that there's an element of trust and a strong reputation to know. Last one for me, before I hand back to Chris, is plan. You can never plan too much. And I guess as we see through this COVID, I keep saying to people, like, get your cash flows out, get your model and plan, recut them, have a look at them. Who would have ever thought the impact of COVID on their business? You've got to plan for all situations. You've got to understand all scenarios and understand the commercial and legal implications of what's ahead of you. So Chris?
Thanks. Just the last call before we open it up for questions. So, both Craig and I have been doing this for many years, and these are some of our sort of reflective observations. Stakeholder communication is crucial, and whether that be, with your suppliers, with your employees, with your bankers. What we've found over many years is that people can deal with bad news. What they can't deal with is silence. And I guess our real sort of key takeaway in terms of, talking to suppliers, keep people informed, keep people up to date. People can deal with bad news far better than many people actually often give them credit for. But what people don't like is uncertainty, which often comes through as a result of silence. So again, we're all for sort of communication. The other thing that we've seen over the last couple of years, which has been really encouraging for our clients, is that banks and financiers are largely supportive of a restructure if they understand the plan and trust the process. So, a lot of companies are very surprised at the support the bankers will give them, because the bankers obviously, at the end of the day, need a vibrant organisation. As long as the bankers understand the risk, as long as they understand the options, our experience is that they are generally supportive. The best restructures are both financial and operational. So again, on the basis of never waste a crisis, you could put any sort of company through a quick sort of VA to cut some leases. Our advice and experience is, though, the best restructures are both financial and operational. If an organisation is looking to cut some leases, there are probably a range of other things that it's looking to do as well. And we would always be encouraging our clients to look at, in addition to reducing leases, what are the other things that they want to do in their business Do, for example, they have a long-dated, out-of-the-money supply agreement, which might have 5 years to run? There are a range of things that if a company was going to go through a restructure or VA, it should look at in addition to its lease liability. And the other point there, which we can put on, new equity through recapitalisation can bring with it many opportunities. So while we've primarily spoken on this call about a company-led voluntary administration and, if you like, a director or shareholder-led deed of company arrangement, in some cases, a deed of company arrangement can actually facilitate the entry of new equity into that business. And that new equity might be a very efficient way to turbocharge the business for future success. That's probably it for Craig and me, but obviously happy to take questions or comments. As you can see from us, we're pretty straight up and down. We'll answer any questions that anyone wants to put to us, either on this call or in a private forum. So back to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was fantastic and very informative. I've got a few questions coming through from our listeners, and one of them is, what happens to the bank guarantee in the scenario of a voluntary administration? That the bank guarantee, obviously, that the landlord holds, number one. Number two is that we've had a scenario where a major REIT, a company had been in voluntary administration, and they, and in fact, I think it was Dexus, and they then did a lot of them do a search and said, well, that company's been in a voluntary administration before, and basically we've got a red flag with any companies that have been in voluntary administration. And the third part of that question is there any reputational or any mark against the directors of the company administration whatsoever?
Well, Chris, why don't I start? And I'll start in reverse. Let's start with the last one. So from an ASIC perspective, once a company goes into administration, obviously it flags with them. I said I've just become administrator of Equestrian Australia. The directors from Equestrian Australia got an automatic note from ASIC, but there's filings with them as well. As far as a black mark, no, the ASIC have a black mark when a company goes into liquidation and it pays a dividend to unsecured creditors of less than 50 cents in the dollar. So to put a company into administration and through a docker and out the other end, there's no black mark at all. That's actually a restructure that they see as a positive. And even then, with a black mark, so the directors, ASIC's more interested in 3 strikes. So if you've presided over and been a liquidator of 3 companies that have gone into liquidation that have paid less than 50 cents, and when I say 3, that's 3. If you go down on a group at once, they don't count that as 3. It's 3 separate occasions. In that as well, they're interested in what the liquidator does. The liquidator administrator has an obligation to investigate and comment on any offences. So breach of director's duties, insolvent trade, blatant insolvent trading type things where they're critical offences. So ASIC's interested in insolvent trading, which has always been that big trigger why directors and why Treasury put some temporary measures in place to get rid of that, so we didn't see a whole heap of companies collapse. So if you come through a restructure through a docker, in short, no black mark. Then going back to your thing about Dexus and company searches, and they see that, interesting, that's starting to change because we often get calls from, I personally often get calls where I've been an administrator of a company or a liquidator of a company or a receiver of a company, and that company, particularly that company or that director's involved in other, and I'll often get a reference check from them. We'll always give a reference on the basis, I'll make a comment to say whether there were any offences, whether we found any offences in the conduct. And generally, particularly bankers often will call about that. But if it's been through a docker, a VA docker, I've never had a call from a banker or a landlord or a stakeholder around that restructure. It's more about a terminal a receivership or liquidation. Well, and Tim, the first question was in relation to bank guarantees. Yep, bank guarantees. Again, they're obviously a landlord has a right to mitigate their loss on that tail. There's always a negotiation on made establishment, which I was the administrator of all of those restaurants. We recovered probably 50% of the bank guarantees just through the circumstances and being able to work with the landlords. But yeah, unfortunately, they're a little bit like a personal guarantee. they need to mitigate their position. They need to justify anything they call against that guarantee. In fact, before I got on the call this morning, I was chasing up the last bank guarantee on that mate establishment because we'd reached an agreement with the landlord where they were claiming 30% of the bank guarantee and returning the balance to us. So again, back to where we started, commercial engagement and negotiation will generally enable you to recover or roll through.
Can I just add something on the bank guarantees, because we do get asked that question a lot, and it's a very good question. And the bank guarantee issue, in my experience, often the importance or not depends on the WALE, so the weighted average lease expiry. So if you've got, let's take a simple example. If you've got, one lease that's got 8 years to run, that's got a 12-month bank guarantee that's well and truly out of the money, it may well be the financially, astute thing to do to walk away from that lease through a VA and leave the bank guarantee. So, ultimately it's a rational financial decision. As Craig has said, obviously you do everything you can not to walk away and leave money on the table, but it's a pretty simple analysis in terms of, what's the financial uplift to the company in the event that it has to cash out that bank guarantee. Does it make sense to walk? Yes, if so, walk. If not, don't do it. But I mean, the great thing about leases, people understand how they're valued. People understand, the impact on P&Ls and cash flows. So it's pretty easy to get a view on the impact of leaving a bank guarantee on the table or getting partial repayment. The other point, which is an interesting one, and again, I'll just sort of put this question out there. So people say, well, what's the black mark, if any, against directors and shareholders and managers? And I guess my question would be to everyone on this call just to reflect on, would you have any issue dealing with Areum? Would you have any issue dealing with Channel 10? Would you have any issue dealing with Virgin? And I think, there's a lot of media noise around it, but I think at the end of the day, most people would have no trouble and are having no trouble dealing with any of those organisations.
All right, and another question is, just going back to that example where you, in the Channel 10 example, where you pick and choose who got 100%, who didn't, could you do a scenario where everyone gets paid 100% except the lease, which you just cut off, and the land, so you've got a very long lease on your head office, that you can do a scenario where you can then, everyone gets 100 cents in the dollar, the lease gets cut off, they get nothing, and then and also on the second part of that, can you avoid someone else buying that business? I come over the top and in that scenario.
Well, no, two parts. I'll start with the second part. Can you avoid someone else buying that business? No. So the administrator needs to be independent, and when you go into an administration, anyone could put a deed of company arrangement up, and quite often, and that's what happened in 10. So I guess the backstory on that was Murdoch, the Murdoch team, existing shareholders, basically squeezed the directors, and it went into administration. And their view was to recut the balance sheet through a deed, and unfortunately, CBS came in and made a better offer through a better docker and succeeded. So the existing shareholder group lost control. So that is always a risk, and the administrator needs to look at it independently and say, well, what is the best outcome for all classes of creditor? On your question about the landlords and leaving them behind, I guess the objective, what the administrator needs to make a recommendation is the deed proposal better than liquidation and better for all classes of creditor. If there was a docker up, you could certainly classify landlords separately to other trade creditors, as we saw in Channel 10. And if that was the only docker and they got left behind, I guess the resolution comes down to the majority of value and number. So as long as the value and number voted in favour of it, and if there was a really large contingent tail on that lease, there would that creditor or those landlords would be able to vote for the unexpired contingent tail of the lease. So it's a bit complex, but you can certainly get there with some analysis and understanding where value breaks, where votes break. because of the democratic system. It's,
Craig, can you just talk a little bit about the administrator's right to disclaim leases and how that sort of plays into all this?
Yeah, well, like there's clear provisions in the Corporations Act that any contract that the administrator deems onerous and not in the best interest has an automatic right to disclaim. So, and then yeah, through the DOCA, you just classify those as onerous leases, and the onerous landlord leases we're going to pay a lower number than we're going to pay for the arrangement you enter into with the ones you drag forward. But that, like I say, that's not leases. It could be a piece of equipment that you've got on a lease that you just decide, no, it's onerous. I don't need that anymore. I'm rationalising. I don't need that factory. Or I've got two operating factories. I don't need that one. So all the equipment in there, there's no value in it. I'm going to disclaim the lot and walk.
Okay, gentlemen, I think that was very, very informative. I thank you very much. And I think that, again, just to recap, we at Tenant CS are thinking about the next time in the cycle. And I think that there's a number of people on the call, and a number of clients have got long lease tails and legacy leases that they've talked to the landlords. The landlords are not communicating. Basically, you know, the likes of Goodman, Dexter, etc., are inundated with, you know, a code, rent reductions, and even if they wanted to engage, they're finding it difficult and not really wanted. So a lot of companies, you know, a lot of companies have been got these legacy long lease issues, and and the landlords generally are not engaging. Any lease sort of more than 2 to 3 or 5 years out, becoming a very, very large problem. And when tenants are saying to us, what can we do? We're generally saying, we've said in the last particular last month, sorry, nothing we can do. So hence the call for today was that, you know, there is something we can do. Obviously it's a big step, but we hate saying to our clients, sorry, nothing we can do. So obviously today's call was, there is next steps, and look, it's something to think about. And gentlemen, thank you very, very much for your assistance today. I think it's been very informative, and everyone on the call, feel free to contact the gentleman just for discuss various situational ideas or options or whatever. And yeah, well, thanks very much. And everyone, and wish you guys luck in your lease negotiations.
Tim, just one thing, just to finish on and your point there. I think I'm not advocating you rush into voluntary administration at all. I don't want people to think that at all. And the radio rentals is the perfect example. We didn't put that company into administration or liquidation, but through planning and analysis, we could sit in front of the landlords and say, if you don't engage, they will. And that brought them to the table and provided a material compromise on all of the leases. So it's about being informed, planning well, and understanding your options. So the mere threat of it, particularly when they see you're well informed and you understand your options, will hopefully then give you some leverage to have a more meaningful discussion with these landlords that at the moment I'm hearing aren't engaging. But on that note, Tim and the team at Tenant CS, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat today. As Chris has said, and as you said, Tim, feel free to reach out. No obligation, totally confidential. I just want people to be informed and understand that now's the time, and there is an opportunity if you do need to. But if you don't, at least you know you've explored all options. So good luck, and if you need some help, give us a yell. If not, hopefully you survive and thrive out the other end of this, like many others.
Okay, gentlemen and listeners, thank you very much.